And and we're live. Folks, welcome to the American Watchman Roundtable. I am one of your hosts, Sam Whitfield, and joined here by Gabe Icaboni and of course Joshua Johnson, my two colleagues over at American Watchman. And tonight we're going to just be discussing the news of the week, several topics. So I'm gonna let Josh get us started here. What's on the docket for tonight, Josh?
Well, first we were going to discuss the big news of the week, which was the attempted bomb plot against several prominent left-wing politicians, activists, and a few media outlets. And the even more breaking news, or latest news, I should say, it was breaking this morning, of the horrific synagogue massacre this morning in I actually have forgotten the state. It was in Pennsylvania.
Which I actually haven't heard about at all. I've kind of been taking a news detox this week. So,
Well,
uh,
I'll fill you in on the basic. Excuse me, got some bad phlegm tonight. I'll fill you in on the basic um, facts of the case. I'm not sure what the motive is, but I think maybe Gabe can correct me on this. But I think the guy was a neo-Nazi, and there were 10 victims. Fortunately, none of them were children. Unfortunately, 10 people are dead though.
Yeah, as far as I know, they haven't really. I mean, other than he yelled something at the shooting, like "I hope all Jews die" or something. Um, I haven't really heard much about whether he was like a neo-Nazi or anything like that. I had just heard that he had yelled pretty much "all Jews must die" when he was shooting the
I
place off.
I I saw that they had said either he had said it at the shooting or maybe it was on one of his social media accounts that he had blamed the Jews for the caravan working its way up through Mexico right now, which would seem to be consistent with the whole Jews will not replace us kind of nonsense that went on at Charlottesville.
Oh, gotcha.
oh, for the love of God.
Um, but that's the basic facts of the case. If you'd like to start hitting us with the questions, Sam.
Uh, did the guy do society a favor and kill himself?
No, no, he is alive and in custody.
Oh,
Yeah.
uh,
Which once
uh,
I might just throw this out there as a kind of not so fun fact, but it would seem I can't remember how long ago it was, but the last synagogue shooting, which I'm not sure if he killed anyone there, but the last time there was a shooting at the synagogue, they got the guy alive too. So it seems like when you have these kind of neo-Nazi inspired racist white supremacist shootings, they seem to end with the shooter being caught as opposed to killing himself like you'd see in a just a mentally ill mass shooting or a Islamic attack or a radical Islamic attack.
has the media tried to politicize this yet?
Kind of. I saw CNN's already put out a story claiming that anti-Semitism is on the rise because this shooting is the deadliest for Jewish people in American history, with 11 people. I misquoted a few moments ago before. It was not 10; it was 11 victims. But it is the deadliest shooting, deadliest anti-Semitic shooting in American history, and so CNN's trying to twist it into being anti-Semitism on the rise kind of deal, trying to tie it into Trump, which is patently ridiculous given that half of his family is Jewish and his own strongly pro-Zionist, pro-Israel record.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's probably a little too early to see the media fully pivot to that. I think the media is more likely to sensationalized, and I know we haven't gotten to this yet, but the man who attempted to or did send a bunch of bombs to a bunch of major Hollywood elites and progressives, they have a much easier time pinning that to Trump than this. Just because it's easier to make the link between Trump and violence versus Trump and specifically anti-Semitism.
I do have to openly wonder at this point, who in there, I mean, I'm not a crazy psychopath, but if I was, I don't understand why I would send very large, conspicuous boxes in the mail to people who don't even open their own mail and expect to get them that way. It doesn't make sense to me.
Well, I mean, from the sounds of it, the guy has the guy is mentally, I mean, he has a disability. So, I mean, the thought process in terms of how he was going to do it, I don't really think he thought through everything in terms of like actually trying to get them, because this was not the packages were easily identifiable. It wasn't like he was putting a ton of thought into like, how can I get this through a security filter?
I actually saw a New York City Police Department retired bomb specialist actually put a tweet out on this when it first came out, saying that the things were so conspicuous it might as well have been a bundle of dynamite with a old-fashioned, old-timey clock tied to it, ticking away. But
are we still alive or?
Yep, we are. I guess Gabe didn't have anything.
Well, I would just say, and maybe this is just me. I'm feeling particularly crabby this week, and because of things outside of politics, as you guys may know. But just in general, I'm just getting really jaded of this whole, blame Trump for, everything, or somehow trying to tie it to them. To Trump. Let's just say for posterity that this guy really was acting completely on his own, that he is mentally deranged, and that there was no false flag, by the Dems or the deep state. The left's mantra ever since Obama came into office was never let a serious crisis go to waste. I talked about that on my podcast earlier tonight, and either way, it seems like they're going to try and use this to break up to get the blue wave re-energized, because that's literally all they have now. So, you said you didn't want to politicize this, Josh, but they the way I see it, they've already politicized this first.
Well, I think it's a pretty sad sign that the way both parties have to try and mobilize people to vote for them at this point is using bomb scares. The other party is full of raging psychopaths that'll murder everybody who disagrees with them. Doesn't seem to be a very healthy line. It doesn't seem to be a line that engenders confidence in how healthy our system of government is. I don't think.
Well, but the thing about this, I mean, that has to be kept in mind, though, is that a lot of this is focusing on it's almost like the way the media portrays it is that rational people are going out and committing these acts, and that's not what's happening. It's individuals with disabilities who are going out and conducting these acts and holding somebody responsible, whether it's Trump or somebody else, for the actions of somebody who is already probably prone to violence because of their disability, is honestly ridiculous, because you're not having 100 rational people go out and shoot up places or send bombs, because then I would argue then that our democracy is not healthy. But these are random acts by people who are taking things completely out of context in terms of whether it's rhetoric or actions. But again, it's only individuals doing this. It's not, say, a group. If it was a group, I would be worried.
I would just add kind of onto that. I wouldn't say that their disability causes it, and I'm just saying that because I like to study this kind of thing. And everybody with a psychological problem, it manifests differently. You know, not everybody with bipolar is going to go out and go postal or whatever.
Right.
But anyways, I would also add that I'll tell our listeners a story. If you've ever worked in politics at anything higher than the dog catcher level, you will have encountered, if you've worked with any campaign, especially on social media, you will have always encountered that one guy who creepily comments on every single one of your candidates' posts, and sometimes also on every single one of your opponents' posts. And they're I'll give you an example. Here in Nebraska, right after the 2014 election, there was this gal who commented on our governor, Pete Ricketts' Facebook page. And it wasn't even the campaign page. It was the official governor's Facebook page. She commented on every single post, blaming Governor Ricketts personally because her children had been taken away from her by the Department of Health and Human Services. I don't know what the governor was feeling, but if I were him or somebody on his staff and she kept on, and this was like for months and months on end, and if I had somebody doing that after a while, I'd begin to be afraid, is this person going to show up at one of my campaign or official events with a gun and shoot me because she thinks I'm the one who's responsible for the government taking her kids? So it's stuff like that, and the thing is, sometimes you have people who, because of their particular illness and the way it manifests, they might take a completely innocuous statement and they'll twist it into some kind of call for violence or whatever. The thing that comes to mind is the guy who thought that by shooting Ronald Reagan, Jodie Foster would fall in love with him. I mean, that's totally insane, but that's what he thought. And I mean, you can't blame the candidate for a crazy person making something crazy out of nothing.
Right. You can't, as nobody can control that. And that's what I think is getting glossed over so far by the media, especially in their portrayal of the bomber having his car plastered in, say, Trump stickers or anti-Nancy Pelosi stickers. That isn't really the root issue. The root issue goes back to mental illness, I think, and how America doesn't deal with it well. That's
something that that could be a topic. That could be a whole other topic.
I know. Yeah.
I could rant on and on about whether we need more funding for mental health care. But I will add what I think is kind of interesting. And this applies more to the shooting than to the bombing. But and again, maybe it only happened this morning, so maybe I'm just being optimistic and hoping that we're not going to this place already. But the media, it doesn't seem like people are jumping to immediately to the gun control discussion that we seem to have on an annual, almost every other month basis anymore.
Not yet. It seems though that the reason why we haven't gone there yet, and again, this is only a day old or less than a day old, is it's because I think the media is more willing to portray it as Trump is fostering hate, right-wing nationalism is on the rise. It's weird. I see this almost parroting like the 90s and Bill Clinton and Waco and the Oklahoma City bombing in terms of the narrative that I think the media is already starting to try and create.
I will just comment, since you brought the word nationalist up. This is also a separate topic that we could do a whole podcast on. But Trump said about a week or so ago that he declared himself a nationalist, and the media freaked out by saying that nationalism isn't the same as patriotism. But I think that whole distinction is almost asinine, because the debate really isn't nationalism versus patriotism. It's healthy nationalism versus unhealthy ultranationalism. There's a big difference between being proud of your country and its history and its accomplishments and its people, and thinking like the Nazis did that your race is superior to everybody else and needs to kill all the other ones. So I think it's not so much nationalism versus patriotism, it's nationalism versus ultranationalism.
Well, but I don't think the media makes that distinction, though.
They don't. No, they try and frame it as nationalist or patriot, and they try and say you can't be one or the other. But it's silly, in my opinion. They present a false dichotomy on that.
Well,
Well,
because
they hear the word nationalist and they automatically just assume it's racial
And the
nationalism.
thing, and it's I'm glad you brought that up, Sam, because it shows that they don't really believe their own crap. Because they always say America is a creedal nation. America is a creedal nation. Well, if you really believed America was a creedal nation, how come the minute somebody says nationalism, American nationalism, you automatically assume it means white people only?
Right, or just bigotry. Nationalism is unfortunately one of those words that has just gotten perverted, so much by the media. It's kind of like well, I mean, I hate to say this, but like back during the 2016 election, alt-right back during the very early days never explicitly meant white nationalism until Richard Spencer hijacked it. Before, alt-right kind of just meant like alternative to the lame GOP that didn't have a spine or anything like that. But then once Richard Spencer came in and kind of said, yeah, I'm the guy who created white nationalism, even though he wasn't, or alt-right, you know, then it got toxified.
I would also add that the fact that they have to call it sometimes white nationalism indicates that normal nationalism is not just about white people, because you wouldn't
Right.
have the qualifier ahead of it anyways. And I would also just add that white nationalism is asinine, because as the word nationalism also subtly implies, you have to have a nation. And the last I checked, white people could be found in almost every single nation in Europe, America, Canada, Australia. So there is no country that is specifically just white people. There are different. There's German, there's French, there's whatever. So I don't. To me, white nationalists are stupid. So I mean that's I guess I'm getting at.
Well, it's they, as we've said, they've turned nationalism into basically the equivalent of Nazism. I
Mhm.
mean, let's be honest. I mean that's pretty much what the media has portrayed it as. And like I said, it feels like a redux of the '90s when anything related to whiteness was related to white nationalism and especially violent white supremacy. And it feels like that's what we're heading back into, especially under Trump, and how the media has tried to paint all his supporters, or a majority of his supporters, being white nationalists, and Trump bringing back white nationalism.
Yeah. I mean, really, I don't know. I don't know what else I can say about this other than that I'm just
Well,
I,
here maybe I can ask the next question specifically to Gabe. Do you think that these bombings or the shooting, if they try and tie it even more to Trump, do you think there's going to be much, if any, impact on the election? I see from the early voting polls that we're already sort of having a red wave in terms of early voting.
I don't think so. I mean, let's be honest. Most people at this point in time have made up their minds who they're going to vote for. I mean, at this point, America has already been separated into its separate tribes, and you can't use this to convince a Trump supporter not to become a Trump supporter, or somebody who already dislikes Trump not to actually like Trump based on his rhetoric in terms of denouncing them, it doesn't. I don't think it will make much of a difference either way.
So I have another follow-up question for you, and as well as a kind of funny observation. First, the follow-up question. So do you think that October surprises, given our hyper-polarized electorate, do you think that the October surprise is even effective anymore? And second, since you mentioned how most people have already sorted into camps, I would just like to note for our listeners, because I was reading about this the other day and I found it hilarious. Mitt Romney's flip-flopped once again and is now becoming more and more friendly to Trump. He also made $83 million in the last 3 years alone, which I thought was kind of disturbing. But anyways, do you think October surprise? Do you think it even matters if there are October surprises in our polarized electorate?
Well, yes, but it depends. I mean, the October surprise was Hillary Clinton in 2016, and that I think did make a difference. In this election, no. I think October surprises are more relatable to a presidential election than a midterm where there are hundreds of elections going on, relatable only to the individual candidate in their district or state. I mean, to have an October surprise that would really have a national impact in the midterm, you'd have to have something, massively significant, like a party aiding, I don't know, the assassination of somebody or something, like some a John Clancy kind of thing for it to actually have a national impact on an election.
So what you're saying, Gabe, is that in order for us to win the election, we have to start World War III in order to get people to rally around the flag.
So, well, we saw the rally around the effect, or the rally around the flag effect in 2002 during Bush's first midterm when Republicans gained seats and they actually gained the Senate. But that wasn't. In October surprise. That was really just the economy was starting to pick back up after the dot-com bubble under Clinton, and people were rallying around the president because 9/11 had occurred and we were going after the Taliban in Afghanistan. But that was building for months. Like that wasn't in October surprise. It wasn't one instance right before an election.
I think I generally would agree with you. I would just throw in too that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but aren't midterms more or less elections where only the political, well, not only the political class, but mainly the political class turns out, because they have an insanely much lower turnout across the board than presidential elections do, right?
Well, I mean, midterms.
When I say political class, I don't mean like the elite ones. I mean those of us that actually follow this stuff and are passionate about, like the activists.
Well, yeah, I mean, the activists and partisans turn out. I mean, midterms tend to be whiter and more educated. And they also tend to have fewer younger voters and fewer transient voters. So yeah. I mean, the early votes that we've seen indicate that there's intensity on both sides in terms of turnout, which I mean is interesting because in terms of Trump's base, they aren't necessarily loyal to, a lot of them aren't necessarily loyal to the Republican Party. So it'll be interesting to see if a bunch of them don't just show up for their early voting like we're seeing now, but they actually show up on election day. Because historically, Democrats win the early vote and Republicans win election day.
I think that makes this interesting in two ways then, because that does, I did not know that it would be so unusual for us to be winning the early vote as it seems like we currently are. But I think what you said about the Trump voters will be even more interesting, because I can speak for myself on this one, although I was supporting the Republican Party long before Trump came up, so maybe I'm not the perfect example. But Trump has been for several weeks now just beating on people to vote for their Republican candidate. And I've actually, as a more populist kind of person, I've actually been sort of I know why he's doing it and it's necessary and all that, but I've been sort of dismayed because I just saw it as him sort of selling out a little bit. But I don't know if the other ones will. I think it'll be interesting to see if they follow his advice or if or what happens, like you said.
Well, I mean, well, I mean, a lot of it'll be interesting to see how that translates because a lot of presidential elections nowadays are more about the identity of the candidate than the actual party themselves. I mean, it with Trump especially, he's created an identity for his supporters, and it's the us versus them. Now, Barack Obama did the same thing. I'm not saying Trump is unique in that regard, but translating that to a political party or to a bunch of candidates, I think the media and especially election analysts, who it's their job to analyze elections, they tend to underestimate that. I mean, they tend to look at history and they tend to go through the whole cycle of elections and presidents lose seats during midterms. But I really think now, with how polarized America is, we're missing the important context of it's hard for modern presidents to translate their support to their party exactly because a lot of their support isn't because of the party. It's because of them individually as a candidate and the message and the narrative that they craft around themselves as an individual.
That could be another whole topic.
I mean, that's why Trump won the election. Trump didn't win the election because he was a Republican. He won the election because he was Trump.
I'd actually say he won the election in spite of being a Republican. but well, I mean, think about it. If any of those other people had won the nomination, there's no doubt in my mind we would have probably went for another loss because Trump didn't campaign like a traditional Republican at all. That was the whole drama of the 16 primary because he flat out came out one time and said this isn't the conservative party, it's the Republican Party.
Right.
But, yeah. I have any other questions on that for us, Sam, or should we maybe move on to the foreign policy realm?
I would just say, or I would just ask, do you think, and I think maybe this is similar to the last question, but do you think there is any chance of the of this bombing, the way the left has tried to frame it, they've tried to tie this guy to Trump. Do you think there's any chance of this whole narrative backfiring on them, like the whole Kavanaugh thing and the Stormy Daniels and Elizabeth Warren? Because because I mean those three narratives that they were all pushed backfired on them. But do you think this one will, or do you think they might have picked like a safe narrative?
I don't I think are you asking does it for example does it turn out they investigate the bomber's background and find out he was a longtime supporter of Democratic policies? Because if that happens, I just feel like they would just stop covering the story and move on to something else. And with the way our news cycle goes anymore, news stories every 24 hours, it's easy for them to just stop covering something, cover something else, and then the people forget about it because everybody's got a 5-minute memory now.
Yeah.
Well, maybe not that, but what I guess what I'm asking is, do you think this will really matter in terms of, or do you think that like, because okay, here's the way I see it, and again, I'm not necessarily saying that this was a false flag, but the Dems shot themselves in the foot with Kavanaugh, with that witch hunt. They shot themselves in the foot propping up Stormy Daniels, and that turned out to be a big pile of nothing. Elizabeth Warren shot herself in the foot, and thereby shot the Democrat Party in the foot. And so, what I'm asking is, do you think that now it seems like they're trying to use this narrative of the whole bombing thing to demonize Trump? Obviously, do you think that will really stop like a red wave, or like a red tide, as I'm calling it,
I don't. I
against the
don't.
blue wave, or do you think it won't really matter?
I don't think so because, like Gabe said, if everybody's pretty well established as to what camp they're in on this now, so I don't think that that would happen, and I also don't think this can backfire on them like Kavanaugh because there are too many variables that are outside of their control. It's not like they're sitting there questioning this guy or anything like that. And I would also just add, with regard to Elizabeth Warren, that I honestly don't think that Indian thing's going to affect the way anybody votes because I don't understand how anybody could give a crap what race she is because to me that seems ultimately irrelevant. It's the candidate should be judged on her ideas and integrity. So maybe you could say, oh, she lied about her race, but it's a stupid thing to lie about. So I mean, I wouldn't because somebody lied about their race. I don't think I would immediately go and say, oh, this person might rob my bank or whatever. I mean, the whole Indian thing just seems stupid.
Well, it would only matter. I mean, let's be honest. The Elizabeth Warren thing would only matter in 2020 because Trump would bring that up. But yeah, like I said before, I don't see these events impacting the midterms. I mean, they basically just reinforce existing opinions one way or the other. So the media spinning the narrative, I don't think at this point is going to matter. The one thing that the media talking about them can do is it does shift the narrative away from how well the economy is doing and what Trump on the policy front is doing. So, I mean, you could argue that it distracts people from the things that Trump wants to talk about. But in terms of shifting people's opinions on issues, I don't think that's going to happen.
Okay.
I just want to say, before we move on, I think we got a bit of an
yeah, I noticed.
I'll try and finish my thought. Anyways, I think Trump has a hard enough time trying to focus his mind on what exactly he wants to talk about. So that's just a little joke I wanted to throw in there. I guess it's a bit of a dud.
I guess Trump and I are feeling much the same way these days, as it turns out on that end of things. And speaking of things we wanted to talk about, let's move on to foreign policy. And Josh, you said you had some breaking news on Jamal Khashoggi, which you kind of shared with us privately, before we started the podcast. And I would ask if you could share this with the audience. So, and on that note, I'm going to step away for a brief moment to use the restroom.
Alrighty. Anyways, it was about an hour ago now that the news first broke, but Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis came out and said that the Saudis' deliberate decision to murder Jamal Khashoggi, or Khashoggi, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce his name. I've heard it so many different ways. That their decision to do that has destabilized the entire region, which is huge news, considering that hitherto the U.S. State Department and Pentagon have always blamed Iran on consistently trying to destabilize the region, even though in terms of the last few years from 2011 onward, the Iranians have done more to stabilize it than the Saudis have. The Saudis being the ones who consistently have funded and armed Wahhabist terrorist groups in Syria and elsewhere, while Iran was putting their forces to trying to stomp out ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Anyways, though, it is huge news that that the U.S. government at such a high level as the defense secretary is finally calling the Saudis out on their game in the Middle East. And I think we'll also see as a result of this, and then I'll maybe turn it over to Gabe for his additional thoughts. I think we'll see because of this, now that somebody so prominent in Trump's cabinet and somebody who clearly has influence on Trump has taken this line, I think we'll start to see Trump be a bit more consistent as well, because up until now, he's sort of flip-flopped back and forth for understandable, if not good reasons. His reasoning for wanting to side with the Saudis at first, I think, had a lot to do with his arms deals and oil, which are not good reasons to let them get away with all the crap they do. But I think that's what Trump's initial reasoning was, and so that's why he flip-flopped, even as more and more evidence came out against the Saudis. But I think after this, he'll be more consistent in holding their feet to the fire on this.
Yeah, maybe. I'll agree with that to a point, but I think that Trump is going to be guided by the people around him on this, and the people around him on this are not necessarily going to run away from Saudi Arabia. I think what'll happen from this incident is that it will galvanize the U.S. to actually use the leverage that we have against them directly and indirectly. I mean, you know, if we stop buying Saudi oil, yes, that's a hit to our economy, but it's absolutely devastating to Saudi Arabia. And we've kind of used kid gloves with Saudi Arabia in the last couple of years, especially with their younger prince, who, for all intents and purposes, has caused the worst humanitarian crisis in the world right now with, I believe it's his war in Yemen.
Mm-hmm.
And we've been largely silent on that when we have the leverage. Basically, we can't make him stop. We can't make him stop what he's doing there, but we can use our leverage to get him to rein it in, to rein it in somewhat there, and also especially in terms of what he's doing at home in terms of crackdown on the media and internal dissent. So, I mean, I don't think it's going to be as public, maybe, as Josh does. I think it will be a lot of back channel communication, basically just saying, hey, you know, we have leverage over you guys. Keep that in mind. And we're not afraid to use it.
I would explain to our listeners as well, because it might seem kind of strange hearing that the Saudi prince is calling the shots. But since Mohammed bin Salman has been named as the crown prince, the heir apparent, the next king, he has more or less become the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia, as his aging father takes more of a we would call it a traditional monarchical role, sort of like Queen Elizabeth. He doesn't really do much,
right?
Except in the Saudi system, the monarch does have absolute power, so he's really just delegating it to the prince, and that's why he's been calling the shots. I would also add too that I think we've become, since our relationship with the House of Saud and the Saudi Arabians began, we've become much more energy independent, and we still have a long ways to go. There's no doubt about it, and we could be doing more about that. But we're in a much stronger position to say we don't need your oil today than we were 5 or even 10 years ago, or I should have said 10 or even 5 years ago. And part of that is because the last few U.S. presidents have begun to slowly notice that the Saudis are not necessarily our friends. Obama, to his credit, began to look more and more into energy independence for us, specifically because of the Saudis' destabilizing role in the region, and perhaps some foresight into seeing that in the long run, this relationship's not beneficial to us anymore, specifically, as Gabe mentioned, in Yemen, because they have undermined our own country's moral authority. If you actually watch C-SPAN and watch the generals and officials from the State Department and Pentagon try and defend American military tech or intelligence's involvement in Yemen, it's borderline ridiculous, because we'll come out and say, oh, well, the Saudis have assured us that they're doing everything in their power to avoid civilian casualties. But if you actually look at what's going on in Yemen, the Saudis are starving thousands of children to death every day, and they're dropping bombs indiscriminately in highly urban, population heavy population dense. That's the word I'm looking for. Areas. So they're not really doing anything to minimize civilian casualties. But because they're using our tech and our intelligence, we've been put in the tough spot of trying to say, oh, well, they told us they were, and that's why we're still giving them these weapons. So I think that's sort of what Obama and and the Trump administration as well, they have begun to see when they began to try and tilt us in a more energy independent, specifically with regard to oil direction.
Okay, I'm back, and I will agree with you know Josh's statement on that as ridiculous as some of this as ridiculous as some of this energy renewable energy stuff has been in terms of politicizing it, like carbon taxes and all that stuff that Al Gore uh,
I think you misunderstood me. I wasn't talking about. I mean, I'm for renewable energy, but specifically, I was talking. We've been building up our reserve of oil over the
right.
last couple of years. That
Right.
way, the idea is that we could, as Gabe mentioned, the idea the Obama administration had was that if we had enough in our reserves, we could just stop buying their oil for a while. And with the Trans Canada pipeline, this was the idea as well. We would be able to import from other sources as well as have enough on tap that their economy would take a much deeper cut in the short term than ours would. We wouldn't experience a 1970s shortage again. I know
Well,
a lot of our listeners are probably too young to remember that, but the last time we had a scuffle with the Saudis in the 70s during the Carter administration over their human rights record, OPEC decided to raise the price of oil.
it's
And
in it's
we wound up having shortages at the pump, and there were lines for miles and miles and miles. And it was a pretty interesting time to be alive. I wasn't, but I've studied it.
well, it's interesting that you bring up OPEC because back in 2012 when Trump was first, I I guess, toying with the idea of running for president, and this was actually the first time where I had actually paid attention to him as potentially a serious candidate. I was saying that Trump could be president even back in 2012 when people were still laughing at him, but anyway, Trump went on to Rush Limbaugh's radio show and did an interview. And for those who don't know, Rush Limbaugh rarely does interviews. He might have someone on his show like maybe once every 5 years or so, but he rarely has interviews on his show. But when he had Trump on his show back in 2012, um, one of the things that Trump brought up to him was, in fact, OPEC and how OPEC is the reason why gas prices are so high. That it's not necessarily a shortage of oil in America like the left wants you to think. It's OPEC and the deals that were made and the bureaucratic red tape. And so,
Well, that's another calculation that the Obama administration took into account when they first began to reassess our relationship with the Saudis and our long-term energy strategy. Because if you think about it, the Gulf states that control the supply of oil, mainly Saudi Arabia, but also smaller states such as Qatar and Bahrain, all benefit from the destabilization in the region. Because the more unstable the Middle East becomes, the higher they're able to raise the price of their oil, particularly with regard to terrorists, because it requires them to station more security around their oil rigs and other systems. During our invasion of Iraq, there was the whole scandal with Blackwater Security and American oil companies hiring all this security personnel just to try and secure and defend oil wells from extremists that were attacking them. But the thing is, of course, a lot of these Wahhabi groups that were attacking us, such as Al Qaeda and more recently ISIS, were receiving back channel funding through Saudi Arabia through Turkey. The idea is that if they can destabilize the region and if they can make it look like these oil wells are under threat and justify companies having to increase their expenses to protect them, then they're able to jack the price up. So they benefit from the region falling apart.
Indeed. So I don't know when I was out. Did you guys cover Khashoggi at
Yep.
all?
Yep.
Okay.
We discussed it, and then I'm actually kind of glad you brought the energy up because I hadn't really been thinking about the energy stuff too much, although that does tie into this. I think it's kind of ironic that Erdogan and the Turkish government have played such a big role in undermining the Saudis on this, because Erdogan occupies an interesting space in that he has tried to. He is Sunni. He is not a Wahhabi of the Wahhabi. The what's the word I'm looking for? The Wahhabi faction of the Sunni Islam, though.
Yeah, the Wahhabis.
Although he's not really opposed it either, and he's also been relatively tolerant of Shiites in Turkey as well, and he's tried to play a bit of a middle of the road strategy between both the Iranians and the Saudis on this. I don't see him in going against the Saudis on this. I don't really think it's a sign of Turkey being more pro-Iran, but I do think it has to do with ISIS's slow but steady decimation. Because you may remember in 2014, I believe it was, Turkey shot down accidentally a Russian fighter jet, and the Russians basically dumped all the intelligence they had on Turkey and Erdogan's government, and basically pointed out that the Turkish military, in its own fight against ISIS in northern Iraq, was allowing ISIS to ship oil for the Saudis. They were basically capturing these oil fields, and then they were getting money for the oil they were selling to the Saudis. And the money was going through Turkey, and Russia dumped all this information out. So I think as ISIS has sort of slowly been driven out of the region, and now that more facts on the ground are going to become readily available, you sort of see the Turks turning against the Saudis in an attempt to cover the fact that they had worked with ISIS more than Erdogan would like the rest of NATO to know. So I think that's another interesting aspect of this whole deal. And to be honest, it did just sort of work out coincidentally for the Turks in this regard, because Khashoggi's murder happened in a consulate inside Istanbul, which means that there is no diplomatic immunity for that facility or anything. That is, the Turkish police have the right to search it, and they have. So it just sort of worked out in a way that the Erdogan and the Turks can kind of cover their own butts for what they've been doing with ISIS and the Saudis behind the world's back. It was sort of Erdogan making use of a crisis, as you kind of noted earlier, Sam.
Yeah. My take on the whole Khashoggi thing, I don't know that much about what happened, but basically, from what I've heard, Khashoggi was a Muslim Brotherhood operative. The media has kind of covered that whole part up. So he's not necessarily the angel that everyone makes him out to be. But with that being said, this once again goes back to the media trying to blame Trump for everything.
Basically. Well, here's the thing, and there was a really good read on the American Conservative about this, and you have to kind of judge for yourself, but I'll use Erdogan as the example. So, excuse me, my phlegm again. So in America, for example, and in Europe, and to an extent in Japan, where Shinto still plays a large role in some political parties, in every society, religion's going to play a role in politics. The Muslim world is no different. And so we have to be careful when we mention Islamism, because there is radical Islamism, such as the kind that ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the others have practiced. And then you also have Islamist politicians like Erdogan, who have, in many ways, if you read about him, he is comparable to the religious right in the United States almost, except with a Muslim flair. And for example, his government has heavily pushed more public funding for Islamic schools. When he came to power, Turkey was strictly secular. They had bans against women wearing the headscarves in public, which really made rural women in Turkey angry. Erdogan's base of support is not urban, it's rural. And so he lifted that ban when he was prime minister. He has imposed restrictions on when you can buy alcohol, sort of like the blue laws we used to have down south that some evangelical and Protestant groups used to push. He has tried to limit and put more restrictions on smoking. He's tried to have more some gender segregation on college campuses and stuff like that. And when I've read it, it seems comparable to the 1980s religious right in the U.S. almost. And so the problem is, as you mentioned, and the American Conservative article mentioned, Khashoggi was a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. But we also have to accept that in this particular area of the world, yes, Islam is going to impact and play a role in their politics to a certain degree.
Sure.
How you want that to manifest itself is the question, because you do not want extremists like the Wahhabis that are ruling in Saudi Arabia, or like the Wahhabis in ISIS or Al Qaeda running the show, because they kill people and there's no tolerance at all.
Well, but
the issue is this, though. When you make it your goal to just oppress, to try and suppress, not oppress, my bad. When you try and suppress that religious tendency across the board, as we have, it makes it look like you're fighting a war on Islam. And that's what many people in the Muslim world have unfortunately come to believe about the United States and about the West. We sort of saw the Obama administration, and I'm not really a fan of the way they tried to do it, because I'm not sure that the Muslim Brotherhood is the kind of group you want in power. But that's what Obama tried to do when they supported Morsi's candidacy in Egypt after the fall of Mubarak. They tried saying, look, these secular dictatorships have started to collapse because people want to have some sort of religious, social conservative aspect in their governments. And they decided in Egypt they'd go with the Muslim Brotherhood. Jamal Khashoggi is a member of that, as you noted. But the thing is, in Saudi Arabia, the Muslim Brotherhood is outlawed strictly by the Wahhabis because they don't subscribe to all of their beliefs and their tenets. Khashoggi was a critic of the way that the Saudi government operates, particularly because there is no democracy. The Muslim Brotherhood is a mass political movement, so they do believe that Muslims should be allowed to go out and vote and do whatever. And so Khashoggi, as he was increasingly critical of MBS, Mohammed bin Salman's increasingly authoritarian rule, they eventually killed him. And it was kind of funny the way they tried to cover it up at first, because he was summoned to the consulate in Istanbul. That same day, Saudi quote-unquote diplomatic team came in, and one of the items that Turkish authorities registered them bringing into the country on the plane that day was a bone saw, which is incredibly suspicious. Then after he turned up dead, at first they denied it and floated the idea to Trump that it might have been some group of rogue killers, but that makes no sense, so that collapsed pretty quick. Then they admitted, yeah, he died, but it was an accident because he got into a fist fight with security personnel. But that collapsed pretty quickly when you consider that a 60-year-old man probably isn't going to try and get into a fist fight with a bunch of young military personnel. And that also still didn't explain why on earth they brought a bone saw with them that day. And then now, just 2 days ago, they finally admitted that there had been a deliberate plot to kill him, but they're claiming the crown prince had no role in it, which is awfully suspect. And it's also incredibly suspicious that the crown prince of all people is the person that the king chose to put in charge of the investigation. So there are stories just crumbling. Today, the Saudi foreign minister came out and said that Iran is a threat to the whole region, which is a clear, desperate attempt on their part to try and pivot back away from this and to appeal to the U.S.'s historic hostility to Iran since the revolution. But long story short, though, as I mentioned, we can't just suppress Islamic involvement in politics completely. We have to suppress the extremists.
I'm not.
We can't just say, look, you can't have Islam involved in your government at all, like we have been, because it doesn't work. And I think Turkey is not a glimmering example. Erdogan is increasingly authoritarian, but it is the way it was done during most of his time as prime minister was a more successful model, and I think that was why he was initially praised in Erdogan's case.
I agree with you, and I'm not saying that Islam as a whole shouldn't be involved in the region, because I do think that is impossible. My problem, and again, I think I could be. This comes from the perspective of being a Christian, but the Muslim Brotherhood, to the best of my knowledge, seems to be a a pretty radical Islamist group in and of itself.
I can't say that I know a lot about the Muslim Brotherhood. I've actually never studied it that much.
Well, well, well,
they somewhat are, but just because they're radical doesn't mean that they don't have a functioning system of support, though. I mean, I remember when who was the former general ruler of Egypt? Was it
that,
Mubarak?
there was Mubarak. He was the dictator who was overthrown in 2011. Then there was Mohammed Morsi, who was the Muslim Brotherhood democratically elected president.
So
now there's Sisi, who's the new general that the Saudis backed in overthrowing Morsi.
So the Mubarak the Mubarak overthrow was interesting and illuminating in terms of the Brotherhood because it illustrated how almost the Brotherhood operated as a para-government or as a quasi-governmental entity in terms of they had their base of support within the citizenry. They were providing water and food to people like a government agency. So I mean, they have their radical elements, but they function very much like a government or a standard or a political party, which obviously they were when they got Morsi elected in 2013.
And I think the reason people have a lot of concerns about them, specifically speaking for Egypt, is after Morsi was elected, there were some pretty nasty incidents, and I think this is where Sam gets more concerned. There were some pretty nasty incidents where the Muslim Brotherhood was out and out persecuting Coptic Christians in Egypt. And I think, and that is a legitimate fear. That's why I don't want to speak too much about them, because I don't know fully what they're. I don't know them like I know the Wahhabis. Let's put it that way, who are even worse, as far as I understand it. But the thing that we need to be, when I brought up, obviously Islam's going to have a role in a society where that's the dominant religion, and it's going to have a political role. We tried to suppress that. It's not worked. So what I think we should be trying to do is trying to find, and I don't want to hold Erdogan up as an example, but he's what comes to mind, because as of now, there have been some things where Christians have benefited. For example, I'll give one. The Christians in Turkey, when Erdogan decided that he was going to take some mosques out of state hands, because forever the very strongly secular, militantly secular Turkish government had taken over some mosques and were not allowing Islamic authorities to have them. When Erdogan passed some laws as prime minister to reform that and allow those to leave government hands, that also benefited some Christians who got church property back from the government. And so I think that's kind of the ideal, where we find a way for that religious party to, such as the AKP in Turkey, to come to power, but at the same time still have religious tolerance and liberty, where minority faiths like Christians or Jews are not being persecuted. And that's where the trick comes in on this, because with the Muslim Brotherhood, as we saw in Egypt, they went after the Copts pretty quick, and that was horrible. But it's a tough question.
Well, it's a tough question, and it's hard for us who have been ingrained in a different culture and a different society, and obviously a different political system, to relate that to their political system, and their culture, because very much it is the majority dominates the minority. In most Muslim countries and with most Muslim governments, although in Iraq you had the opposite, where the minority Sunnis controlled the majority Shiites. But yeah, finding that balance is I mean, honestly, my inclination is they're going to have to do it. That we can't do it for them. And I know for us in the West, that's really hard for us to grasp, but it's pretty true.
It's Gabe's spot on, I think, because ever since Bush was president, not so much under Reagan or Bush Jr., Bush Sr. or Clinton, although it was starting to sort of get there in the early phases. We need to drop this neoconservative mindset that we can run the Middle East, or we can tell them how to run their countries. I think the region would be a lot better off if we didn't have us or other great powers constantly trying to come in and dictate to them how to live their lives. And I also know, though, that that could lead potentially to conflict with between regional powers like Saudi and Saudi Arabia and Iran. But we're already seeing that, and that conflict is magnified and made potentially worse by the fact that they could draw other superpowers in to a conflict that really isn't our business.
See, it's interesting. It's interesting that you bring that up, though, because speaking as a formal as I guess someone who speaking as someone who I guess you might consider a neocon when it comes to the Middle East. I've never directly seen our role as necessarily telling the Middle East how to run their countries. I've seen it more as stomping out the radical elements of Islam to make sure that, like, I guess Muslims can live their lives, in peace and not have.
I guess I'll point you again. Sort of. This is why what I tried to say earlier. Look at Iran in I believe it was 79. The Shah was imposed by Western powers, and he was rapidly secularizing the country, which did have its benefits, and from our perspective might seem great. But let's not forget that the Ayatollah didn't come to power as a minority. He came to power on a revolution. The Ayatollah Khomeini came to power on a revolution because Shiite people in Iran wanted to have more of a say in how their society was run, and they wanted clerics to be more involved in the government. So the people found a way to speak again. And I think that's sort of the impulse that I'm getting at, is that we shouldn't be trying to impose a government on people who don't want one. That's part of the reason that Iraq imploded so quickly, because we went from having a Sunni minority dictatorship in the form of Saddam Hussein to imposing a Sunni democratic government that was still trampling on them. And then you had Shia backlash. Then you had the Shiites come to power briefly under Maliki. And we didn't like that. So we backed the Sunnis in overthrowing him, and it threw the country into the chaotic state that it's been in for the last few years since Maliki was ousted, where ISIS was able to grow rapidly.
I guess I just it seems to me like the Middle East tends to kind of go back and forth between two extremes, either extreme secularism or extreme radical, extreme radicalism.
I think it's best if we look at it in a pre-World War II or even a pre-World War I history of the region. Because, yes, there were instances of radical Islamic sects rising up. What immediately comes to mind for me as a student of British history is the Mahdi during the uprising in Egypt in the late 1890s. And he was a guy, he was a Sunni tribesman who thought he was the Mahdi, which is an Islamic version of the second coming of Christ. And he tried taking over the entire region. And the British, who were at the time very invested in North Africa, particularly Egypt, were not too keen on that happening. And so they fought him until he drove them out of he succeeded in driving General Gordon's army out and actually killing General Gordon, unfortunately, at the Battle of Khartoum. But then British reinforcements arrived and decimated the guy. But if you look at the region before Western powers began getting actively involved, the Ottoman Empire also comes to mind here. It wasn't necessarily always peaceful, but there was a lot. The Islamic extremism didn't pop up quite so much. The Islamic extremism, as we understand it now, and there's a great video on YouTube that I can send you by the same people who do the Great War series. That's it's partially put on by the BBC, talking about World War I. I'm sure you might know of it, Sam. But the same historians that do that have an episode where they discuss Islamic extremism as we've come to know it, like Osama bin Laden. And that's really a phenomenon that only began to pop up in the 1980s after we armed the Mujahideen in Afghanistan.
Right.
the notion of suicide, for example, suicide bombers, or the notion that you can get these 82 versions by being a martyr, as the terrorists would put it. That's an incredibly recent phenomenon. That didn't show up until Afghanistan in the 1980s. That was not common in Islamic warfare prior to that point. So the way we've come to the Islamic extremism that we're dealing with is almost a monster of our own creation, in that it did not seem to exist in the form that it presently does prior to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would certainly be interested in looking, at those BBC documentaries. I have heard of them. I just haven't watched them in like a super long time. Adam, right? It is close to getting to 11:30 Eastern time. So, are there any other topics that you guys would like to discuss?
You've gone kind of quiet on me, Gabe.
Well, this is more your topic than mine. But I don't have any additional topics.
There's one way that we can get Gabe to talk foreign policy with me, and that's to bring up France. But unfortunately, I have no news out of France. So
yeah, I don't know what to tell. I don't know what to tell you there.
Well, I'm sure in the next week or two we'll have more foreign policy to discuss, especially with Mueller's report likely to come out right after the election.
Are we finally done with that almost? I've stopped paying attention.
Supposedly, the investigation they're done with witnesses, and so now it's just a matter, I think, of them finalizing the report. I did read an article on that the other day that says that we may never see a full report. It just kind of depends on the powers that be whether they want it released or not.
You gotta love the way they can never actually release. I will mention this since it ties in. I thought about saying it earlier, but it might have led me onto a tangent, so I didn't. So Khashoggi, back in Saudi Arabia, his son or brother, I can't remember which, has decided to move out of the country. Which, after the government kills your immediate family member, it's probably a good idea to get out of Dodge. But if you remember, during the I forget his name now, the former Russian spy that was poisoned in England, his daughter, as I mentioned before on an episode of our podcast, was still living and is still now living, even after she allegedly got poisoned by the Russian authorities. She went back to Moscow to live there again. And the media never interviewed her or asked her any questions. We weren't allowed to hear from them after they got better in the hospital. So you always have to love these reports where they never let the people actually see what they found, or they won't allow the people to actually hear from the people that were supposedly poisoned by the Russians, who still think it's a good idea to live in Moscow. So I guess that's my kind of closing thought, unless Gabe got something to add there.
No, I mean that's pretty true. I mean there are lots of reports that take years to come out, if they ever come out, like the Whitewater report on the Clintons, that didn't come out till after Bill Clinton was out of office. So it took him about 6 years to spit that one out, and which is different than the Mueller investigation because there's no national security issues involved.
And since we're kind of mentioning those reports, and again tying it to Saudi Arabia, the parts of the 9/11 report regarding Saudi Arabia's involvement are still redacted. Congress still hasn't put out the full report on how involved the Saudis may have been in getting the 9/11 bombers here.
Yeah, exactly.
So I guess if that's it, you can close us out for tonight, Sam.
I guess my final thought is I can't wait until until 2018 is over in terms of the news cycle. It feels like we've gone from one clusterfuck news story to another, and
it's going to be a long 5 years for you, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. It feels like it feels like we've crammed 5 years into 1 year in terms of news. So, but by the end of 5 years, I'm pretty sure I'll feel like we just lived through 50 years of news. So,
It'll
so
be interesting to see how we all look back on this. When we're like 70 years old and being interviewed for some CNN documentary on the 2010s. But
yeah, it'll be really interesting when my grandkids they'll probably find this in many other podcasts, and they'll be like, Grandpa, tell us about the 2000s and the 2010s. So
I don't know if you saw this, but Gabe, you might get a laugh out of this. I saw a report in the Washington Post the other day that said as many as 40% of college students could be suffering from PTSD from the 2016
Oh,
election.
I did hear that. Yeah.
So what's really going to happen is we'll be like 70 years old and we'll be sitting there for the CNN interview and they'll mention the 2016 elections and our faces will freeze and we'll like have a Vietnam flashback. And they'll be like, oh no, don't go there with it.
uh, I'll just go dark and be like, I was a veteran of the great meme war of tw- of 2016. So um ne- never
Start muttering "lock her up" over and over again. The nurse has to come grab you and be like, "Oh, it's okay, it's okay." Walk you out of the room and he's like, "Lock her up, lock her up."
Sam, it's okay. It's okay. She's been dead for 60 years now. So probably longer at that point. So although my worst nightmare would be if she and Source were still alive somehow. And if they just never died, that would be like my worst nightmare. So but anyway, yeah, all jokes aside, this has been a long news year, and I guarantee you the next few years are going to be just as nuts. So, but all I can say is once 2020 rolls around, we're gonna win bigly again. I hope. So, uh, with that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the podcast. For those of you who either listened to this or watched on YouTube, and thanks for tuning in. And from all of us here at American Watchmen, have a good night. God bless, and God save this great nation.